Jake Turner, a 40-year-old security guard, was finishing up his shift at a remote industrial site outside of Lubbock, Texas. The area was quiet, nestled in the middle of the vast West Texas plains, far from the busy streets of the city. Jake worked the overnight shifts, monitoring surveillance cameras and patrolling the perimeter of the facility. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent and the solitude suited him. Tonight, the weather was unusually warm for a Texas winter night, and Jake was relieved that he wouldn't have to deal with the biting cold. As he drove the security truck around the site, the lights from the nearby storage containers reflected in the rearview mirror. He rolled the window down a little, letting in the cool breeze. The night was still, except for the hum of the generator powering the security lights. It was well after midnight when Jake decided to make his rounds through the back entrance of the complex, an area that was often overlooked. The roads around the site were deserted, with no traffic or passing cars. It was one of those nights where the silence was almost overwhelming. He slowly turned onto a gravel path that led to the back gate. Something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light. But as he drew closer, he realized that there was a vehicle parked near the fence, just outside the perimeter of the site. It wasn't unusual to see a few cars driving by, but this one was parked in an area that was clearly off-limits. Jake slowed the truck and checked the rearview mirror. The vehicle's headlights were off, and the engine was silent. He squinted into the darkness, trying to get a better look, but couldn't see much more than the outline of a large SUV. He felt a sense of unease in the pit of his stomach. He grabbed the radio and called into the office. "This is Turner, 206. There's a vehicle parked at the west gate. It's not supposed to be there. I'm going to check it out." "Copy that, Turner," the dispatcher responded. "Be careful. There's no other activity on the cameras in that area." Jake grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck. He locked the doors behind him, a habit he never broke, no matter how quiet it was. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the parked vehicle. The SUV was a dark color, maybe black or navy, and had tinted windows. No signs of anyone inside. He stopped a few feet away, scanning the area for any signs of activity. The surrounding brush and tall grass created shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. As he neared the vehicle, he noticed something strange. There was a faint odor in the air, like burning rubber, but it wasn't strong enough to be overwhelming. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jake tapped the side of the SUV with his flashlight, a signal to announce his presence. "Hey, this is security. If you're just passing through, you need to leave now," he called out, his voice steady but his mind alert. There was no response. The vehicle remained still. Jake stepped back and started walking around the SUV, keeping his flashlight on the ground, trying to avoid making himself an easy target. As he rounded the back of the vehicle, he froze. The rear door was slightly ajar. His pulse quickened, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't locked. Why wasn't it locked? He approached cautiously, his hand hovering near the radio on his belt. He was about to reach for the door when he heard a faint sound, footsteps crunching on the gravel behind him. His heart skipped a beat, and he whipped around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. A figure stepped out of the shadows, hands raised. "Easy there, man. No need to get jumpy," the man said, his voice calm but with an edge. Jake's grip tightened around the flashlight. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and had an unshaven face. His expression was unreadable. "I'm going to need you to tell me who you are and why you're parked here," Jake said firmly, his training kicking in. "This is private property. You're trespassing." The man took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just a little lost, that's all," he said, a slight chuckle in his voice. "I had some car trouble, and I was just waiting for help. Didn't mean to scare anyone." Jake's mind raced. He didn't believe the man's story for a second. If his car had broken down, why park in such an isolated area? And why had he been so quiet, not calling for help? Jake wasn't about to let his guard down. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Jake said, his voice colder now. The man hesitated, glancing around as if considering his options. For a brief moment, Jake thought the man might try something, but then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn driver's license. "Here," the man said, stepping forward and handing it over reluctantly. Jake took a moment to examine the ID. It looked legitimate, but something about the way the man was acting still didn't sit right with him. Just as Jake was about to respond, the radio crackled in his ear. "Turner, be advised. We've got a breach on the main gate. There's an unauthorized vehicle trying to enter. You need to get back to the office now." Jake's stomach dropped. He glanced back at the SUV. The man was still standing there, a smirk slowly spreading across his face. The situation was escalating, and Jake could feel the tension in the air. He took a step toward the truck, keeping his eyes on the man. "Stay here. I'll be right back," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm as he reached the security truck. His hand was already on the radio, preparing to report the breach. But when he turned back around, the man had vanished, leaving nothing but the faintest sound of footsteps fading into the night. Jake's heart pounded. He didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer just dealing with a routine security check. Something was very wrong that he jumped into the truck and headed back to the main entrance, his eyes darting to every corner of the site, wondering if the strange man was still out there or if he was already one step ahead. Jake's mind raced as he sped back to the main entrance. The radio crackled again, this time more urgently. "Turner, can you confirm the situation? We've detected motion at the gate, but we haven't been able to reach anyone on site." Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter. He knew he couldn't waste time. As he approached the main gate, he noticed the lights flickering, a sign that something was off. He slowed down, scanning the area for any movement. The gate, usually locked and secure, was slightly ajar. His heart skipped a beat. Jake pulled the truck up close to the gate, keeping his distance in case anyone was hiding nearby. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the vehicle, his eyes darting around the perimeter. The site was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of the generator and the soft rustling of the wind in the dry grass. He crept toward the gate, shining the flashlight along the ground, looking for signs of forced entry. The dirt around the gate was disturbed, footprints leading away from it toward the open field. It was clear someone had tampered with the lock, but there was no sign of who or what had caused the breach. Jake's pulse quickened. He was trained for these situations, but the unease from the earlier encounter lingered. Something wasn't right. He walked back to his truck and radioed the dispatcher. "I've got a breach at the gate. No sign of anyone on site, but I found some footprints leading away from the entrance. I'm going to do a full sweep and check the perimeter." "Understood, Turner. Be careful. We've escalated the situation and alerted local law enforcement. Let us know if you need backup." Jake nodded to himself, trying to steady his nerves. He got back into the truck and started driving along the edge of the property, scanning the area carefully. As he moved farther into the site, he noticed something else. Another vehicle, this one parked on the far side of the lot near the warehouse. It was a white pickup truck with no lights on, parked at an odd angle. Jake parked his truck a safe distance away and grabbed his radio again. "Dispatch, I've got another vehicle on the property. A white pickup truck near the warehouse. I'm going to check it out. Copy that. Stay alert, Turner. Police should be en route, but it might take a few minutes. Jake's stomach tightened. The feeling of being watched returned. He slowly approached the truck, shining his flashlight at the ground. There were more footprints around it, leading toward the building. But as he neared the pickup, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The driver's side door was slightly open. He stopped dead in his tracks, scanning the area for any movement. The warehouse was dark, and the wind had picked up, making the entire site feel more isolated. Jake felt like he was in a game of cat and mouse, but he wasn't sure who was playing what role. After a few seconds, he walked cautiously toward the truck. He shone the flashlight into the cab, but it was empty. The keys were still in the ignition, and the engine was cold. It had been parked for a while, but there were no signs of recent activity inside. Jake took a deep breath and backed away from the truck, trying to stay calm. It was clear that someone was on the property. But who? And why? Just as he was about to radio dispatch again, he heard a noise behind him, a door slamming shut. Jake spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping the area. There, at the edge of the warehouse, he saw a figure moving quickly toward the shadows. His heart raced. This was no longer a routine security check. Without thinking, Jake moved toward the warehouse, trying to get a better look at the person, but he was careful not to make too much noise. The figure stopped at the side of the building, just out of sight, then disappeared behind it. Jake hesitated, weighing his options. He could wait for the police, but they were still a few minutes away. Or he could investigate further, potentially putting himself at risk. He made his decision. Jake called dispatch again. Dispatch, I've got a suspect near the warehouse. They're moving toward the back. I'm going to follow up, but I need backup as soon as possible. Copy that, Turner. Police are en route. Hold your position and don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Jake nodded to himself. He had his orders. He couldn't afford to be reckless. But as he crept closer to the warehouse, he heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle starting up in the distance. He quickly turned around, rushing back to his truck. The white pickup truck was now driving away, speeding off into the night. Jake didn't have time to get a license plate number or chase after it. He needed to stay focused. The wind howled as Jake climbed back into the security truck, his mind racing. He was unsure whether the situation had been resolved or whether it was only just beginning. Within moments, the sound of sirens filled the air, and police vehicles approached the site. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he prepared to brief the officers. The night had become anything but ordinary, and Jake knew he wasn't going to be able to shake the feeling that something bigger was going on, something that, for now, he could only guess at. As the officers arrived, Jake stepped out of his truck and walked toward them, his mind still spinning with questions. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the last time he'd find himself facing something strange on this desolate stretch of land. Jake watched as the police officers stepped out of their cars, their flashlights sweeping across the site. He briefed them on the situation: the vehicle breach, the white pickup truck, and the figure he had seen moving around the warehouse. His words felt rushed, and he couldn't shake the adrenaline that was still coursing through his veins. One of the officers, a tall woman with short blonde hair, nodded. All right, Turner, stay with us. We'll need to take a full sweep of the area and check for any evidence. As they made their way toward the warehouse, Jake kept a close eye on the officers, trying to process everything that had happened. The whole situation felt off, like it was just the tip of the iceberg, but he wasn't sure what he was missing. The police quickly secured the perimeter, and the officers began their search. Jake stayed back, observing from a distance, trying to avoid getting in the way. After a few minutes, the officers returned to him. "We found the tracks you mentioned near the pickup truck, but it looks like they lead to a back road just outside the property line." "Officer Carter?" The blonde officer said. "We couldn't find anything inside the warehouse, no sign of the suspect. But there are some tire marks near the fence. Looks like they drove off down the road." Jake nodded, his gut still telling him something wasn't right. "What does that mean? Did we miss something?" Officer Carter paused, looking at him thoughtfully. "It could mean someone was casing the place or looking for an opportunity. They might have been waiting for you to make your rounds before making a move. But we'll need to investigate further. We're going to talk to local businesses and check security footage from the area to see if anyone saw anything unusual." Jake couldn't help but feel a bit of relief. At least there was some action now. "So, what happens now?" "We'll file a report, and I'll make sure the site is monitored for the next few days. We'll keep an eye on the area and see if anything else comes up. For now, you should stay alert and make sure the perimeter stays secure." Jake took a deep breath. "I'll keep an eye on things. Thanks, officer." As the police vehicles pulled away and the sirens faded into the distance, Jake stayed behind to finish his rounds. The adrenaline was wearing off, but the unease remained. He couldn't stop thinking about the white pickup truck and the figure he had seen. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't quite add up. He spent the rest of his shift walking the grounds, checking the security cameras, and making sure everything was locked down tight. His mind kept drifting back to the earlier events, the way the man in the shadows had disappeared so quickly, the vehicle parked at the wrong angle. It all felt like a setup, but for what purpose? By the time his shift ended, the sun was just starting to rise over the horizon. He was exhausted, but there was no sense of closure. He made his way to the office to sign out, still turning the events over in his mind. That as he stepped into the security office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his supervisor. "Good work tonight, Jake. We've received a call from a nearby gas station. They reported a suspicious vehicle matching the description of the white pickup truck you saw. We're having a follow-up investigation. Be ready for a debrief in the morning." Jake let out a sigh, his thoughts racing once again. There was more to this than he realized, and he wasn't sure he'd ever get all the answers. But for now, at least the investigation was in motion. He left the office and climbed into his truck, the early morning sun casting long shadows on the empty lot. As he drove home, the events of the night played out in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that whatever had happened tonight wasn't the last he'd hear of it. The rest of the drive was quiet, but the questions lingered, and Jake knew one thing for sure. He'd be paying closer attention the next time he worked the overnight shift, because there was still a lot he didn't know about what had really happened on that desolate stretch of land in West Texas. Ethan had been working the night shift for several months now, and he had grown accustomed to the isolation. His patrol route took him around the perimeter of the complex, checking the fences, doors, and surveillance cameras. Most of the time, everything was fine. Tonight, however, something felt different. As he drove past the gate on his first round, Ethan noticed a truck parked by the entrance. The sun had just dipped below the horizon. The sun had just dipped below the horizon. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and Ethan Harris, a night security guard at a small warehouse complex outside of Amarillo, Texas, prepared for his shift. The warehouse was situated on a quiet stretch of land, with nothing but the occasional truck passing by on the nearby highway. It was the kind of place where not much ever happened, and most nights, Ethan would spend his time patrolling the property and waiting for the clock to hit 6 a.m. when his shift would end. Venom. Ethan had been working the night shift for several months now, and he had grown accustomed to the isolation. His patrol route took him around the perimeter of the complex, checking the fences, doors, and surveillance cameras. Most of the time, everything was fine. Tonight, however, something felt different. As he drove past the gate on his first round, Ethan noticed a truck parked by the entrance, just off the main road. It wasn't unusual to see vehicles stop for a few minutes, but this truck had been there for a while. He hadn't seen anyone around, and no deliveries were scheduled. Ethan slowed the truck and pulled up next to the vehicle. The engine was off and the lights were dim. He turned on his flashlight and scanned the area. The truck was an old, rusted model with a Texas license plate. No one was inside, and the keys were still in the ignition. His first instinct was to call dispatch, but then he hesitated. There wasn't anything overtly suspicious, and it was possible the driver had just stopped to rest. He decided to walk up to the truck, his boots crunching in the gravel. As he approached, he noticed the passenger side door slightly ajar. Ethan frowned and leaned closer. There was a bag sitting on the seat, but what caught his eye was the faint smell of gasoline in the air. It wasn't strong, but enough to make him uneasy. He stepped back, reached for his radio, and contacted dispatch. "This is Harris. There's an abandoned truck at the front gate. No sign of the driver. I'm going to take a closer look." "Copy that, Harris," came the voice over the radio. "Stay alert. We'll notify local law enforcement." Ethan continued his inspection of the truck. The windows were rolled down slightly, and the inside appeared cluttered with papers and tools. There was nothing overtly suspicious, but the presence of gasoline in the air was unsettling. It didn't seem right. He decided to check the area around the truck. Walking around the perimeter of the warehouse, Ethan kept a careful eye on the surrounding land. The moonlight illuminated the dusty ground, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. He circled back to the truck and noticed something that made his heart race: a trail of footprints leading away from the vehicle, heading towards the far side of the warehouse. His instincts kicked in. Someone had been here recently. Ethan didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the thought of a potential break-in made him uneasy. He checked his watch. It was 11:45 p.m., well past the usual time for any deliveries or pickups. His hand shook slightly as he radioed dispatch again. "I found footprints leading away from the truck, heading toward the warehouse. I'm gonna check it out." "Roger that, Harris. Stay safe. We've got a unit on the way." Ethan switched off the engine and grabbed his flashlight before making his way to the back warehouse. He followed the footprints, his mind racing with possibilities. As he approached the building, the feeling of isolation pressed down on him. The only sounds were the distant rustling of wind and the hum of his own breath. When he reached the rear of the warehouse, Ethan paused. The back door, which was always locked, was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like this earlier in the evening. His heartbeat quickened, and his senses heightened. Someone had definitely been here. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open slowly and crept inside. The air was cool and musty, and the faint scent of gasoline lingered. His flashlight beam bounced off stacks of boxes and metal shelves. There was no sign of movement. Ethan stepped further into the warehouse, his flashlight scanning the space. Everything seemed still, but something didn't sit right. As he moved deeper, he heard a faint noise like something scraping against the floor. He froze, his hand tightening around the flashlight. He turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. His heart was pounding in his chest. He needed to make a decision. Should he continue to investigate or retreat and wait for law enforcement? Before he could decide, the radio crackled to life. "Harris, this is dispatch. We've got a unit en route, but we're picking up something odd on the surveillance cameras near the back of your location. We're seeing movement." Ethan's stomach dropped. He quickly moved toward the nearest exit, stepping cautiously around boxes and crates. The last thing he wanted was to run into someone inside the warehouse alone. His mind raced with scenarios. What if the person was armed? Or worse, what if there was more than one person? He reached the exit door, his hand on the handle, when suddenly he heard a voice from behind him. "Stay right where you are." Ethan's heart nearly stopped. He froze, not daring to turn around. The voice was low and gravelly, but clear. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. There was a pause, then a man's voice responded, "Just put down the flashlight, and no one gets hurt." Ethan's eyes scanned the dimly lit warehouse, his mind racing. He needed backup, but he was alone, and the closest officers were still several minutes away. He could feel the tension in the air. Whoever was inside wasn't here for something harmless. Ethan had no choice but to stay calm and wait for law enforcement to arrive. His radio was still in his hand, and he hoped that the officers would get here in time. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The silence was broken only by the sound of breathing, his own and the intruder's. The door to the warehouse creaked open, and Ethan's hand tightened around the radio. Whatever happened next, he had to stay alert. Ethan's mind raced as he stood frozen, trying to gauge the situation. The intruder's voice was low, but it carried a sense of authority, like he had done this before. Ethan slowly lowered his flashlight, his breath steady but shallow. He needed to buy time. "Listen," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just the security guard. The police are on their way, and they'll be here soon." The intruder didn't respond right away. Ethan could hear his footsteps moving closer, the sound echoing off the concrete floor. He felt the tension build as the man stopped just out of his sight, probably trying to assess his next move. Ethan felt the cold metal of the radio in his hand, just out of sight of the intruder. If he could make a quick call, maybe he could get help sooner. He inched his thumb toward the button but hesitated. One wrong move and the man might act faster than the police could respond. The silence stretched on, and then the voice broke through again. You don't need to call anyone. Just stay where you are, and I won't hurt you. Ethan didn't believe him, but he wasn't in a position to argue. He tried to keep his focus, thinking through his options. Then, as if on cue, a distant siren wailed, growing louder. The sound of police vehicles approaching. Ethan's pulse quickened. The intruder must have heard it too. There was a brief pause, and then a harsh whisper came from behind him. You've got 5 seconds to get out of the way, or things will get worse. Ethan didn't hesitate. He made a quick decision. He bolted toward the door he had just passed, hoping the intruder hadn't anticipated his movement. His boots pounded against the floor as he sprinted, his mind screaming at him to get out of sight. As he reached the door, he turned the handle and burst into the open air, just as the sound of approaching footsteps followed. The night air was cool against his face, but his adrenaline made him feel as if the temperature had dropped. He barely made it to the other side of the warehouse when he heard a car screech to a stop nearby. Police cruisers were pulling in, their headlights blinding in the darkness. Ethan ran toward the officers, shouting to alert them. He's inside the warehouse. He's armed, get in there. Several officers rushed toward the entrance, their weapons drawn. Ethan stepped back, staying out of their way, his heart pounding. The officers moved quickly, clearing the space with professional precision. The intruder was apprehended without much resistance, and as the situation was secured, Ethan took a moment to catch his breath. One of the officers turned to him. You did the right thing calling it in. We might have been too late if you hadn't noticed something was off. Ethan nodded, still shaken. I wasn't sure what to think at first. It didn't feel right, but I'm glad I called you. As the intruder was taken away in handcuffs, Ethan stood there, watching. The police would handle the investigation from here, but he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had been a close call. The quiet warehouse complex he had patrolled for so long had turned into the scene of a dangerous confrontation, and it was far from over. The officers began their questioning, and Ethan felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. He had kept his cool, but there was no doubt in his mind being a security guard was never just about watching a quiet lot. It was about staying alert for the unexpected.